My son Michael screamed, "Get out of my house, you're nothing but a burden," and threw my belongings onto the front lawn in front of all the neighbors. But what he didn't know was that the simple white envelope I left on his kitchen table contained documents that would make him realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, one that would cost him everything he thought he was entitled to. Before I tell you how one envelope completely destroyed my ungrateful son's world, please hit that like button and subscribe to support the channel. Also, drop a comment telling me about a time someone completely underestimated what you were capable of because they thought they knew your whole story. Your experiences inspire these videos, and I read every single comment. My name is Dorothy Mae Richardson, but everyone calls me Dot. I'm 72 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was living in the small guest room above my son Michael's garage in Millbrook, Vermont, the same garage where I'd been staying for 2 years after what everyone believed was my financial ruin following my husband's death. If you saw me shuffling around Michael's property, helping with household chores and babysitting my granddaughter Emma, you'd probably think I was just another elderly widow who'd lost everything and was now dependent on her adult child's charity. You might feel sorry for this gray-haired grandmother who seemed grateful for a roof over her head, wearing the same 3 outfits week after week and never seeming to have spending money for anything beyond the basics. You'd see me clipping coupons at Michael's kitchen table, carefully counting out exact change at the grocery store, and graciously accepting hand-me-down clothes from neighbors who felt bad for the poor old woman living in her son's garage. You might even think how generous Michael was for taking in his destitute mother during her time of need. You'd watch me washing dishes after dinner, folding laundry in the basement, and keeping quiet during family discussions because I was grateful for their charity. You'd see an elderly woman who appeared to have no options, no independence, and no value beyond the household tasks she could perform in exchange for basic shelter. And that's exactly what my family thought they knew about me. Quote, "They had no idea that the broke old woman cleaning their bathrooms and doing their laundry had been quietly orchestrating one of the most sophisticated business deals in Vermont's history, while they dismissed me as a useless burden. They saw my humble circumstances and assumed complete dependency. They saw my quiet acceptance of their charity and assumed I had no other options. They saw my age and assumed I was finished contributing anything meaningful to the world. They couldn't have been more wrong about any of it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how Michael's cruelty became the catalyst for the most devastating lesson in respect he would ever receive, you need to know the whole story. You need to understand who I really am, what I've been hiding for 2 years, and why the people who should have known me best never bothered to look beyond the surface of the woman they thought they were doing a favor by housing. My story begins 50 years ago when I was a 22-year-old secretary at Hammond & Associates, a small accounting firm in Burlington. The year was 1974, and I was fresh out of high school with dreams that seemed much bigger than the opportunities available to young women in rural Vermont. Most girls my age were expected to get married, have children, and support their husbands' careers while finding fulfillment in domestic life. That's where I met my husband, Robert Richardson, a kind and hardworking man who handled the firm's payroll and bookkeeping. Robert was honest, dependable, and completely content with his modest salary and simple ambitions. He wanted a comfortable life with a loving wife, maybe some children, and enough savings to retire peacefully when the time came. Robert was the kind of man who measured success by the quality of his character, rather than the size of his bank account. What Robert didn't know, what nobody knew, was that his quiet, supportive wife had a mind for numbers that far exceeded his own, and an understanding of financial markets that would have impressed the most seasoned investment professionals. While Robert balanced checkbooks and processed payroll, I was teaching myself advanced accounting principles by studying the firm's most complex corporate clients. When Hammond & Associates handled mergers, acquisitions, or major financial restructuring, I would secretly photocopy the documents and study them at home, learning how successful businesses were built, managed, and expanded. When Robert came home talking about his workday, I was secretly analyzing market trends and investment opportunities that he never even noticed. While he read the sports section of the newspaper, I was studying the financial pages with the intensity of a Wall Street analyst. While he watched television in the evenings, I was reading investment books I'd borrowed from the library under fake names because I didn't want anyone to know about my interests. While he was content with our modest lifestyle, I was quietly building the foundation for wealth that would eventually dwarf anything our neighbors could imagine. Robert knew I helped him review our personal finances, but he had no idea that I was also managing a growing portfolio of investments that I'd started with just $50 from my first paycheck. He was happy to let me handle our household budget while he focused on his job, never realizing that his wife was actually running a sophisticated investment operation from our kitchen table. I started small and careful. $50 in a savings account became $50 in a conservative stock fund. When that fund performed well, I reinvested the profits and added another $50 from my next paycheck. Within 6 months, I had $200 working for me in the stock market, generating returns that exceeded our household savings account by almost 300%. But I was careful never to let Robert see the investment statements. I had them sent to a post office box I'd rented under my maiden name, and I studied them during my lunch breaks at work, or in the early morning hours before Robert woke up. As far as he knew, I was just a dutiful wife who helped balance the checkbook and clip grocery coupons. By the time Michael was born in 1975, I had already built our secret investment portfolio to over $30,000, money that Robert didn't even know existed. While I was changing diapers and preparing dinner, I was also buying and selling stocks, tracking dividend payments, and steadily building wealth that would ensure our son's future in ways that Robert's accounting salary never could. Michael grew up thinking his mother was just a stay-at-home wife who helped Dad with the bills. He never knew that the woman who packed his school lunches and attended his soccer games was also the architect of the family's true financial security. I would sit in the bleachers at his Little League games, cheering for his hits and catches, while mentally calculating dividend payments and analyzing quarterly earnings reports I'd memorized from my morning research sessions. Robert and I lived modestly, saved diligently, and gave Michael a comfortable but not extravagant childhood, not because we couldn't afford more, but because I believed in building lasting wealth rather than displaying temporary prosperity. We drove reliable used cars, lived in a modest but well-maintained home, and took family vacations to state parks rather than expensive resorts. Our neighbors saw a typical middle-class family living within their means. They had no idea that the quiet housewife next door was actually one of the most successful individual investors in Vermont, consistently outperforming market indices while maintaining a facade of financial mediocrity. Michael's childhood was filled with love, attention, and everything he needed, but never everything he wanted. When other kids got expensive toys for Christmas, Michael got thoughtful but modest gifts. When his friends' families bought new cars every few years, we kept our reliable vehicles until they were truly worn out. When other families took elaborate vacations, we enjoyed camping trips and visits to free museums. I wasn't being cheap, I was being strategic. Every dollar we didn't spend on temporary pleasures was a dollar that could be invested for long-term security. Every modest choice we made was building a foundation that would eventually provide Michael with opportunities his friends could never imagine. But Michael didn't understand this philosophy. As he grew older, he began to resent what he saw as his parents' lack of ambition and unwillingness to enjoy the fruits of their labor. He complained that we were too conservative, too cautious, too willing to settle for less than we deserved. When Michael graduated from high school in 1993, he made it clear that he wanted a different kind of life than his parents had chosen. He wanted success, prosperity, and the kind of lifestyle that demonstrated achievement. He was embarrassed by our modest home, our practical cars, and our simple pleasures. Quote, Michael went to the University of Vermont on a partial scholarship, supplemented by money from our quote, which Robert believed came from his salary but actually came from my investment profits. Michael studied business, convinced that he would build the kind of wealth and success that his parents had never pursued. During college, Michael met Jennifer Walsh, a bright and ambitious young woman who shared his desire for a more affluent lifestyle. Jennifer came from a family that valued appearances, status symbols, and the kind of conspicuous consumption that Robert and I had always avoided. She was sweet and well-meaning, but she couldn't understand why Michael's parents lived so modestly when they could obviously afford better. When Michael and Jennifer got married in 1997, Robert and I paid for a beautiful wedding that cost more than our annual household budget. Michael assumed the money came from loans or credit cards, never questioning how his frugal parents could suddenly afford such an expensive celebration. I was happy to provide that gift for my son, even though it meant revealing more financial capacity than I usually displayed. After the wedding, Michael started his own landscaping business with money he assumed came from Robert's retirement savings. In reality, the $15,000 he needed for equipment and startup costs represented less than 1 week's growth in my investment portfolio. But I let Robert take credit for providing our son's business loan, because maintaining my financial anonymity was more important than receiving acknowledgement for my contributions. Michael's business did well initially. He was hardworking, honest, and skilled at both the creative and practical aspects of landscaping. Within 3 years, he had a steady client base, reliable equipment, and enough income to buy a nice house in the suburbs and start a family with Jennifer. When my granddaughter Emma was born in 2001, I was overjoyed. Emma was a bright, curious child who brought immense happiness to our family. I loved spending time with her, reading stories, teaching her about plants and animals, and watching her discover the world with the wonder that only small children possess. But Emma's birth also marked the beginning of changes in Michael's attitude toward money and success. Jennifer had expensive tastes in baby equipment, children's clothes, and family activities. Michael wanted to provide Emma with every advantage, every opportunity, and every luxury that he felt he'd missed during his own childhood. The landscaping business expanded rapidly as Michael tried to generate the income needed to support Jennifer's spending and his own growing ambitions. He hired additional employees, purchased more equipment, and took on larger commercial contracts that promised higher profits but also required significant upfront investments. When Robert died of cancer 8 years ago, Michael was devastated, and I was heartbroken. Robert had been my partner, my best friend, and the father of my child. His death left a void in my life that I knew would never be completely filled. But I was also prepared in ways that Robert had never fully understood. Robert's life insurance provided a decent benefit of $75,000, which seemed substantial to Michael and Jennifer. They assumed this insurance money, combined with our paid-off house and modest savings account, represented the entirety of his parents' financial legacy. But my investments had grown to over $3.2 million, wealth that I'd been building successfully for decades, while appearing to be nothing more than a devoted housewife and mother. Even then, I didn't tell Michael about the full extent of our assets. He inherited his father's tools and personal effects, and he received a portion of the life insurance money to expand his business. Michael used this money to purchase better equipment and hire more employees, believing he was building success through his own hard work and his father's modest legacy. Michael had married Jennifer with dreams of prosperity, but the reality of small business ownership was more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Jennifer continued to spend money on home improvements, family vacations, and lifestyle upgrades that strained their budget. Michael worked longer hours, took on more clients, and pushed himself harder trying to generate the income needed to satisfy their growing expenses. But Michael's landscaping business struggled more than he admitted to anyone, and more than I initially realized. The first sign of trouble came about 3 years after Robert's death, when Michael started making comments about how expensive it was to maintain our family home. He'd visit for Sunday dinner and mention that the property taxes seemed high for someone on a, quote, fixed income, that the heating costs were probably significant during Vermont winters, and that maybe I should consider downsizing to something more manageable for a widow living alone. The second sign was his increasing interest in my monthly expenses and daily activities. He'd ask pointed questions about my grocery bills, my utility payments, and whether I was managing okay financially. He seemed particularly concerned about my ability to maintain the house properly, often pointing out minor maintenance issues that needed attention and suggesting that keeping up with repairs might be becoming too much for me. Michael would walk through the house during his visits, examining the windows for air leaks, checking the furnace filter, and commenting on the age of appliances as if he were conducting an inspection. He'd suggest that replacing the roof might be expensive, that the driveway needed resurfacing, and that the electrical system was probably outdated. "Mom," he'd say with carefully manufactured concern, "this house is a lot of responsibility for someone your age." Have you thought about what you'll do when major repairs become necessary? The furnace isn't going to last forever, and replacing it could cost thousands of dollars. But the biggest warning sign was how quickly Michael's attitude toward me changed when his business started losing money. Michael's landscaping company had expanded too quickly during the good years, taking on too much debt to finance equipment purchases and payroll expenses. He'd assumed that growth would continue indefinitely, but a severe economic downturn in 2015 caused many of his commercial clients to reduce their landscaping budgets or cancel contracts entirely. Residential clients began doing their own yard work or hiring cheaper competitors. Several large accounts that had provided steady income for years suddenly disappeared as businesses tightened their budgets. Michael was facing serious financial problems, but instead of asking for help or admitting his mistakes to his family, he started looking at my situation as a potential solution to his own difficulties. That's when Michael decided that his aging mother was becoming a quote, burden who needed his management and support. Michael began suggesting that living alone was becoming, too much for me, that maintaining our family home was unrealistic for someone my age, and that I would be much happier in a smaller, simpler living arrangement where I wouldn't have to worry about property maintenance, yard work, or household repairs. He presented his concerns as loving worry about my welfare, but I could see the calculations behind his compassionate expressions. Michael was looking at my house as an asset that could solve his business problems, and he was positioning himself as the dutiful son who was concerned about his mother's welfare. "Mom, I've been thinking about your situation," he'd say during our phone conversations, "and I'm really worried about you living in that big house all by yourself. What if something happens? What if you fall down the stairs or have a medical emergency? What if the furnace breaks down in the middle of winter?" Michael painted scenarios where my independence was dangerous, my living situation was unsustainable, and my stubbornness about maintaining my lifestyle was actually a form of irresponsibility that could endanger my health and safety. The manipulation became more aggressive when Michael's business debts reached critical levels. 2 years ago, Michael called me on a Tuesday evening with what he described as devastating news about his financial situation. His voice was shaking as he explained that his landscaping company was facing bankruptcy, that he was about to lose his house, and that Jennifer was threatening to leave him if he couldn't stabilize their finances. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with the kind of desperation that breaks a parent's heart, "I don't know what we're going to do. We're about to lose everything, and Emma is going to have to watch her family fall apart because her dad failed as a businessman. I've tried everything. Loans, credit lines, selling equipment, but nothing is enough to cover what we owe." Michael explained that he needed immediate access to significant capital to save his business and his marriage. He'd already exhausted his credit options, borrowed against his equipment, and used up all of his savings trying to keep the business afloat. The only remaining asset that could generate the money he needed was my house. "Mom, I know this is a huge ask, and I wouldn't even suggest it if we weren't desperate, but would you consider selling the house and moving in with us temporarily? The equity would be enough to save my business, and you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or living alone anymore. It would solve both of our problems. You'd have family security, and we'd have the capital to get back on our feet." Michael presented his proposal as a win-win solution. I would get the security of living with family, and he would get the capital injection needed to save his business and his marriage. He made it sound like I would be doing myself a favor by giving up my independence to help him avoid bankruptcy. But I knew Michael well enough to recognize that this wasn't really a request. It was the beginning of a pressure campaign designed to convince me that selling my house was the obvious and necessary solution to both of our situations. What Michael didn't know was that his, financial situation could have been solved with a simple phone call to his mother, without requiring me to give up my home or my independence. The money he needed to save his business represented less than 5% of my actual assets. But Michael had never asked about my resources. He'd simply assumed that the house was my only significant asset, and that I was living on Social Security and whatever small savings his father had left behind. Instead of telling Michael the truth about my financial situation, I decided to see how far he would go with his manipulation strategy. I wanted to understand whether my son would attempt to control and manipulate his mother for financial gain, or whether he would find ethical ways to solve his problems without exploiting family relationships. I agreed to move into the small apartment above his garage temporarily while we, quote, explored options for my housing situation. I presented myself as the grateful mother who was touched by her son's willingness to help during a difficult time. Michael, that's very generous of you and Jennifer to offer, I said carefully. Let me think about it, and maybe we can work out an arrangement that helps both of us. Michael was thrilled with my cooperation, believing that he'd successfully convinced me to start the process of liquidating my primary asset for his benefit. But what Michael didn't realize was that I was conducting an experiment in family loyalty and character that would reveal everything I needed to know about the man I'd raised. Quote, what happened next would exceed even my own expectations for how ugly family manipulation can become when money is involved, and how devastating the consequences can be when someone underestimates the capabilities of the person they're trying to control. The small apartment above Michael's garage was supposed to be a temporary arrangement while we, quote, figured out the best solution for my housing situation. But from the moment I moved my few belongings into that cramped space, it became clear that Michael and Jennifer had very specific ideas about what my future should look like, and none of those ideas involved asking me what I actually wanted. The apartment itself was barely 400 square feet, with a tiny kitchenette, a single bedroom, and a bathroom so small you could barely turn around. Michael had presented it as a cozy, comfortable space where I could maintain my independence while having family nearby. In reality, it felt more like a storage unit than a living space, and I suspected that was intentional. Jennifer had furnished the apartment with cast-off furniture from their house, a lumpy couch that had seen better days, a dining table with wobbly legs, and a bed that creaked every time I moved. The message was clear. This wasn't a place where I was expected to live permanently, but rather a temporary holding area while they worked on their real plan for my future. From my first week in the garage apartment, I could see that Michael and Jennifer had already begun treating me less like a family member and more like a dependent who owed them gratitude and compliance in exchange for their charity. Mom, we've set up some ground rules to make sure this living arrangement works for everyone, Michael announced during my first Sunday dinner in their house. He handed me a typed list of quote expectations that read more like instructions for a tenant than guidelines for a family member. The list included restrictions on when I could use their laundry facilities, limitations on my access to their kitchen, requirements for advance notice if I wanted to have visitors, and expectations about my contributions to household chores. I was expected to help with cleaning, babysitting Emma, and yard work in exchange for my free housing. But the most revealing item on the list was the requirement that I discuss any major financial decisions or expenditures with Michael before proceeding. He wanted veto power over how I spent my own money, presenting this control as quote family financial coordination rather than what it actually was. Supervision designed to prevent me from making any decisions that might interfere with his plans for my assets. Quote, Michael, I said carefully, reading through the list, some of these expectations seem a bit formal for a family arrangement. Mom, we want to make sure everyone's comfortable with the situation. Jennifer and I have never lived with a parent before, and we want to establish clear boundaries so there aren't any misunderstandings or conflicts. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. We just want to make sure everyone knows what to expect. We're all adjusting to this new dynamic, and having clear guidelines will help everything run smoothly. What they were really saying was that they wanted to establish my subordinate position in their household from the beginning, so I wouldn't develop any sense of entitlement or independence that might interfere with their ultimate goals. Over the next few weeks, Michael's treatment of me evolved from subtle control to increasingly obvious manipulation. He would make comments about my daily activities, my spending habits, and my decision-making that were designed to undermine my confidence and establish his authority over my life. Mom, do you really need to buy name-brand groceries? He'd ask when I returned from shopping. The generic versions are just as good, and you should be thinking about conserving your resources for more important things. When I mentioned wanting to get my hair done at the salon, Michael would frown and suggest that such expenses were frivolous for someone in my financial situation. When I talked about visiting friends or attending community events, he'd express concern about my driving ability and suggest that maybe I should limit my outings to essential errands. Mom, I've been thinking about your car, Michael said one evening as we sat on his back porch. That Toyota is getting pretty old, and I'm worried about you driving it much longer. Maybe it's time to consider giving up driving and relying on family for transportation when you really need it. My car was a 2012 Toyota Camry with less than 60,000 miles. Hardly a vehicle that posed safety concerns. But Michael wanted to eliminate my independence and mobility, making me completely dependent on his family for transportation, and, by extension, for access to the outside world. Every suggestion Michael made was presented as concern for my welfare, but the cumulative effect was to isolate me from my previous life and make me increasingly dependent on his approval and assistance for basic activities. Quote, but the most insidious part of Michael's manipulation was how he began involving my granddaughter Emma in his campaign to convince me that living with them permanently was the best solution for everyone. Emma was 9 years old, sweet and loving, and completely unaware that she was being used as a tool in her father's manipulation strategy. Michael would have Emma spend time with me in the garage apartment, talking about how much she enjoyed having Grandma nearby and how sad she would be if I moved away. Grandma, Emma would say as we worked on puzzles together, Daddy says you might not stay with us forever. I hope you don't leave, because I like having you here to read stories and help with my homework. Michael was teaching Emma to express emotional attachment to my presence, but he was also teaching her to see me as someone who needed care and supervision, rather than as an independent adult who was capable of making her own decisions. When Emma would ask questions about why I was living in the garage instead of in my own house, Michael would explain that Grandma's house was too big for her to take care of by herself, and that families needed to help each other when people got older and needed more support. He was training Emma to see my presence as a caregiving obligation rather than a choice, and to understand that elderly people naturally became burdens that younger family members had to manage. 3 months into my stay in the garage apartment, Michael began introducing the topic of my house more aggressively. He'd found a real estate agent who specialized in properties owned by elderly sellers, and he'd started researching the current market value of my home. Mom, I had Maria Santos come take a look at your house, Michael announced during one of our weekly, quote, family meetings, another innovation he'd introduced to formalize discussions about my situation. You had a real estate agent inspect my house without asking me? I just wanted to get a professional opinion about its current condition and market value. Mom, Maria thinks the house could sell quickly in today's market, especially if we price it competitively. She estimates it could bring anywhere from $420,000 to $450,000, depending on how quickly we want to move. Michael had not only arranged for a real estate evaluation without my permission, but he was already talking about pricing strategies and timeline, as if my decision to sell had already been made. Quote, Michael, I haven't decided to sell my house. Mom, I know this is a big decision, but we need to be realistic about the situation. You can't maintain that property forever, and the longer we wait, the more expensive the maintenance becomes. Maria says the roof will need replacement within the next few years, and the heating system is old enough that repairs are becoming difficult and expensive. How does Maria know about the condition of my roof and heating system? I gave her a key so she could do a thorough inspection. Mom, I'm looking out for your interests here. If we're going to sell, we want to know exactly what we're dealing with in terms of repair costs and market positioning. Michael had taken it upon himself to give a stranger access to my home, conduct inspections of my property, and develop marketing strategies for an asset I hadn't agreed to sell. He was treating my house as if it were already his to manage. Michael, that house belongs to me, and I didn't give you permission to have it inspected or evaluated. Mom, you're getting upset about details. The important thing is that we have good information to work with when we make decisions about your future. Maria's evaluation shows that selling now would give you enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, without worrying about property maintenance or unexpected expenses. What do you mean by living comfortably? Well, after we pay off any remaining debts and cover the real estate fees, you should have around $400,000 to invest for your retirement. That's enough to generate a decent monthly income. Plus, you'll save all the money you're currently spending on property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Michael had calculated my entire financial future based on the sale of my house, assuming that the proceeds would represent the totality of my assets. He was planning my retirement lifestyle around an income stream that represented less than 3% of my actual wealth. But more troubling than his financial assumptions was his presumption that he had the right to make these calculations and decisions without my input or consent. Michael, what makes you think I want to sell my house? Mom, be honest with yourself. You're living here with us because maintaining that place was becoming too much for you. You moved into the garage apartment because you recognized that you needed family support. Selling the house is just the logical next step in accepting that your living situation has changed permanently. Michael was rewriting the history of my move to suit his narrative. I hadn't moved in with them because I couldn't maintain my house. I'd moved in to see how they would treat me when they thought I was financially dependent on them. But Michael had convinced himself that my presence proved his assumptions about my declining capabilities and need for management. What if I'm not ready to sell my house? Mom, readiness isn't really the issue here. The issue is what makes practical sense for your situation. You're 72 years old, you're living on a fixed income, and you have an asset that could provide financial security for the rest of your life. Holding on to the house for sentimental reasons isn't fair to yourself or to your family. Not fair to my family? Mom, if something happens to you while you still own that house, Emma and I will have to deal with a complicated estate situation. We'll have to maintain a property we can't afford while going through probate proceedings. It's much better to simplify your assets now, while you're still mentally sharp enough to make good decisions. There it was, the threat that had been lurking beneath all of Michael's concern and manipulation. He was telling me that my mental sharpness was temporary, that my decision-making window was closing, and that I needed to act quickly before I became incompetent to manage my own affairs. Michael was creating a sense of urgency around decisions that didn't need to be rushed, pressuring me to take irreversible actions based on his timeline rather than my own preferences. But he wasn't finished with his pressure campaign. 4 months into my stay, Michael announced that he'd found the perfect long-term living solution for me, Meadowbrook Senior Community, a assisted living facility about 20 minutes from his house. Mom, I want you to come look at this place with me. They have everything you could need: meals, housekeeping, activities, medical support, transportation. You'd have your own apartment, but you'd also have all the services and social opportunities that would make your life easier and more enjoyable. Michael had scheduled a tour of Meadowbrook without asking me, just as he'd arranged the real estate evaluation of my house without my permission. He was moving forward with plans for my future, as if my consent were a formality rather than a requirement. Michael, I haven't agreed to move to assisted living. Mom, I'm not asking you to commit to anything. I'm just asking you to look at your options so you can make an informed decision. Meadowbrook has a waiting list, so if you decide you're interested, we need to get your name on the list soon. A waiting list for what? For their assisted living apartments. Mom, the good facilities fill up quickly, and Meadowbrook is one of the best in the area. They have a beautiful dining room, activity programs, a library, even a small gym. You'd be around people your own age who are dealing with similar life transitions. Michael was describing Meadowbrook as if it were a resort rather than an institution, emphasizing amenities and social opportunities while downplaying the loss of independence and autonomy that moving there would represent. What does Meadowbrook cost? It's very reasonable, especially considering everything that's included. The monthly fee is $4,200, which covers your apartment, all meals, housekeeping, activities, and basic medical monitoring. When you factor in what you're currently spending on food, utilities, and maintenance, it's actually quite economical. Michael had already researched the costs and calculated how my house sale proceeds could fund several years of assisted living. He'd worked out the entire financial equation without involving me in any of the planning or decision-making. But the most revealing part of his Meadowbrook proposal was the timeline he suggested. Mom, they have an apartment available now, but they can only hold it for 30 days. If we want to secure it, we need to put down a deposit this week. I know this feels rushed, but good opportunities don't wait, and I don't want you to miss out on a place this nice. Michael was creating artificial urgency to pressure me into making a decision before I had time to fully consider the implications. He wanted me to commit to assisted living while I was still adjusting to the temporary arrangement in his garage, before I'd had time to explore other options or consider whether I actually wanted to give up my independence. Michael, 30 days isn't enough time for me to make such a major decision. Mom, what's there to decide? You're already living in assisted housing with family support. Meadowbrook would give you the same support with better amenities and professional care. The only difference is that you'd be around people your own age instead of feeling like a burden on your son's family. Michael was framing my presence in his house as a burden that I should want to relieve, while presenting assisted living as a favor he was doing for me rather than a solution to his own problems. I don't feel like a burden, Michael. Mom, I know you don't want to feel like a burden, but you have to understand our situation. Jennifer is working full-time, I'm trying to save my business, and we have Emma to think about. Having a third adult in the house changes the family dynamic, and everyone has to make adjustments. There it was, the confession that my presence was problematic for their family, despite their previous claims that they enjoyed having me nearby and that the arrangement was working well for everyone. If my presence is a problem, Michael, I can always move back to my house. Mom, that's not a realistic option anymore. You've been living here for 4 months because you couldn't manage on your own. Moving back to an empty house, where you'd be isolated and responsible for all the maintenance, doesn't make sense at this stage of your life. Michael was trying to convince me that 4 months of voluntary living in his garage had somehow erased my ability to live independently. He was treating temporary assistance as proof of permanent incapacity. But the conversation that finally revealed the true scope of Michael's manipulation came during a family dinner in late fall, when Jennifer made a comment that exposed their real timeline and expectations. Michael and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if we could get everything settled before the holidays, Jennifer said as she served dessert. The paperwork for Meadowbrook, the house sale, all of that. It would be nice to start the new year with everyone in their permanent situations. Permanent situations? Well, with you settled at Meadowbrook and us able to focus on getting Michael's business back on track. The stress of managing 2 households and worrying about your situation has been really difficult for Michael. Jennifer had just revealed that they'd already decided my future, set a timeline for implementing their plans, and were treating my agreement as a foregone conclusion rather than a decision that was still being considered. Quote, Jennifer, I haven't agreed to move to Meadowbrook or to sell my house. But you have to do something. You can't stay in the garage apartment forever, and you can't go back to living alone in that big house. Michael has been researching options and handling arrangements because someone needs to make decisions about your future. Why does someone else need to make decisions about my future? Michael jumped in before Jennifer could answer. Mom, because you're not making any decisions. We've been having these conversations for months, and you keep saying you need to think about things without ever reaching any conclusions. At some point, practical decisions have to be made. What if my conclusion is that I want to keep my house and live independently? Mom, that's not a realistic conclusion based on your actual situation. You moved in here because independent living wasn't working anymore. You can't just ignore that reality because you prefer a different option. Michael was insisting that his interpretation of my circumstances was more accurate than my own assessment of my situation and capabilities. He'd decided that I was incapable of independent living, and he wasn't willing to consider any evidence to the contrary. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the garage apartment, I realized that Michael's manipulation had reached the point where he genuinely believed he had the right to control my life for my own good. He wasn't just trying to access my assets. He was trying to convince himself and me that his control was necessary and beneficial. But Michael still had no idea what he was actually trying to control, or what the consequences would be when I decided to stop playing along with his assumptions about my capabilities and resources. The next morning, I made a phone call that would begin the process of Michael's education about exactly who he'd been trying to manipulate. I called Harrison & Associates, the most prestigious financial management firm in Vermont, and scheduled a meeting with senior partner Elizabeth Harrison. Ms. Harrison, my name is Dorothy Richardson, and I need to discuss some estate planning and asset protection strategies. I'm dealing with a family situation that requires immediate and comprehensive legal planning. Mrs. Richardson, I'd be happy to meet with you. What kind of assets are we discussing? Single quote. Approximately $3.4 million in investment accounts, plus real estate and other holdings. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Richardson, I think we should schedule an appointment as soon as possible. Do you have documentation of your current holdings? I have complete records going back 20 years. Ms. Harrison, I also need to discuss strategies for protecting elderly people from family manipulation and financial abuse. I see. Mrs. Richardson, these are exactly the kinds of situations our firm handles regularly. How soon can you come in? Tomorrow morning if you have time. Mrs. Richardson, for a portfolio of that size with family protection concerns, I'll make time. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Michael's manipulation campaign was about to collide with the reality of exactly who he'd been trying to control. But first, he was going to escalate his pressure tactics one more time, giving me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the difference between what he thought he was dealing with and what he was actually facing. Because Michael was about to learn that underestimating a woman who'd been successfully managing multi-million-dollar investments for 5 decades was the most expensive mistake he would ever make in his life. The offices of Harrison & Associates occupied the top 2 floors of Burlington's most prestigious financial building, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Champlain and the distant mountains. As I sat in the marble-appointed lobby the next morning, waiting for my appointment with Elizabeth Harrison, I reflected on the irony that Michael thought he was protecting a helpless elderly woman who was actually meeting with Vermont's most exclusive wealth management firm. Elizabeth Harrison was exactly what I'd expected from her reputation, a sharp, well-dressed woman in her 50s who specialized in protecting high-net-worth clients from family manipulation and estate disputes. Her office was elegant but understated, with legal degrees from Harvard and Wharton prominently displayed alongside awards for excellence in fiduciary management. Mrs. Richardson, thank you for coming in. I've reviewed the preliminary information you provided, and I must say your situation is both impressive and concerning. Impressive because of the wealth you've built independently, and concerning because of the family dynamics you've described. Ms. Harrison, I need to know what options I have for protecting my assets from family members who think they have the right to control my life and finances. Let's start with documentation. Can you show me records of your current holdings? I opened the briefcase I'd brought and spread out 20 years of investment statements, tax returns, and portfolio summaries that told the story of my financial success. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. Mrs. Richardson, this is extraordinary. Your investment performance has consistently outperformed market indices while maintaining excellent diversification and risk management. You've built substantial wealth through sophisticated strategies that most professional money managers would envy. Thank you. Ms. Harrison, my concern is that my son has been pressuring me to sell my house and move to assisted living based on his assumption that I'm financially vulnerable and mentally declining. He's made arrangements for real estate evaluations and facility tours without my consent, and he's treating my resistance as evidence of incompetence rather than autonomy. Mrs. Richardson, what you're describing is a textbook case of financial elder abuse. Your son is attempting to control your assets through manipulation and false claims about your capacity. The fact that you're sitting here demonstrating clear mental acuity while discussing a multi-million-dollar portfolio proves that his assumptions about your competence are completely unfounded. What can I do to protect myself? Several things. First, we'll document your cognitive competence through professional evaluation. Second, we'll restructure your estate planning to prevent any possibility of outside control over your assets. Third, we'll explore legal remedies for the manipulation you've already experienced. Elizabeth pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes as we discussed my situation in detail. Mrs. Richardson, I want to be very clear about something. Your son's behavior isn't just inappropriate, it's potentially criminal. Elder financial abuse is a felony in Vermont, and the penalties are severe when the attempted theft involves assets of this magnitude. I'm not interested in sending my son to prison, Ms. Harrison. I want to protect myself and teach him a lesson about respect and assumptions. I understand. But Mrs. Richardson, you need to consider the possibility that your son won't stop his manipulation attempts just because you resist them. Men like your son often escalate their tactics when they encounter opposition, especially when substantial assets are involved. What do you mean by escalate? Guardianship petitions, claims of mental incompetence, attempts to have you declared unable to manage your own affairs. Your son could go to court and present evidence of your alleged decline, requesting legal authority to control your finances and living situation. The thought of Michael attempting to have me declared legally incompetent was chilling but not surprising given the pattern of manipulation I'd already observed. Could he succeed with such a petition? Not with your cognitive abilities and financial sophistication, but guardianship proceedings can be expensive and emotionally traumatic even when the petitioner loses. The best defense is overwhelming documentation of your competence and evidence of his manipulation. Elizabeth outlined a comprehensive protection strategy that would not only defend me against Michael's current manipulation but would also position me to take offensive action if his behavior escalated further. Mrs. Richardson, I recommend that we arrange a complete cognitive evaluation with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who specializes in competency assessments for high net worth individuals. We'll also want to document your current investment activities and decision-making processes to demonstrate ongoing mental acuity. What about my estate planning? We'll restructure everything to ensure that your son cannot benefit from his manipulation attempts. If Michael is trying to control your assets through pressure and false claims, he should face consequences that reflect the seriousness of his behavior. Ms. Harrison, I want Michael to understand that his assumptions about my capabilities and resources have been completely wrong. I want him to realize that the helpless widow he's been manipulating is actually someone with substantial power and sophisticated legal representation. Mrs. Richardson, I think we can arrange for a very educational experience for your son, but first, let's make sure you're fully protected from any legal challenges he might attempt. Over the next 2 hours, Elizabeth and I developed a comprehensive strategy that would protect my assets, document my competence, and position me to respond decisively to any further manipulation attempts from Michael. 3 days later, I underwent the most thorough cognitive evaluation of my life with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a neuropsychologist who specialized in competency assessments for complex estate planning situations. Mrs. Richardson, I'm going to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your cognitive function, including memory, reasoning, problem-solving, and decision-making capabilities. This assessment will provide legal documentation of your mental competence that can be used to defend against any challenges to your autonomy. The evaluation took 6 hours and covered every aspect of cognitive function imaginable. Memory tests that required me to recall detailed information after various time delays. Mathematical calculations that tested my ability to work with complex numbers and percentages. Logical reasoning exercises that assessed my problem-solving skills. Financial decision-making scenarios that evaluated my judgment about investment and estate planning choices. Mrs. Richardson, Dr. Mitchell said as she reviewed my results, your cognitive function is not just normal for your age, it's exceptional. Your memory, reasoning ability, mathematical skills, and judgment are all in the 98th percentile. You scored higher on these assessments than most people half your age would. And your professional opinion about my competence to manage my own affairs? Mrs. Richardson, you're not just competent to manage your own affairs, you're exceptionally qualified to handle complex financial and legal decisions. Anyone who questioned your mental capacity would have to ignore overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Perfect. Exactly what I needed for the legal protection Elizabeth had recommended. Meanwhile, Michael's pressure campaign was intensifying as his self-imposed holiday deadline approached. Mom, we need to make some decisions, Michael announced during our weekly family meeting in early November. Meadowbrook can only hold that apartment for another week, and Maria Santos says the real estate market is starting to slow down for the winter. If we're going to move forward with your transition, we need to do it now. Michael, I haven't agreed to any transition. Mom, you can't just avoid making decisions indefinitely. You're living in a garage apartment because your previous living situation wasn't sustainable. Meadowbrook offers a permanent solution that addresses your needs for social interaction, medical support, and daily assistance. What if I told you that I'm perfectly capable of living independently and managing my own affairs? Michael exchanged glances with Jennifer, and I saw something flicker between them. Impatience, frustration, maybe even anger that I wasn't cooperating with their timeline. Mom, wanting to be independent and being capable of independence are two different things. We've been living with you for 4 months, and we've seen the challenges you face with daily tasks, financial decisions, and practical planning. What challenges? Mom, you forgot to pay your phone bill last month. You got confused about the schedule for garbage pickup. You've had trouble operating the new television remote. These aren't major problems individually, but together they show a pattern of declining function that we can't ignore. Michael was fabricating evidence of cognitive decline based on trivial incidents that had perfectly reasonable explanations. I'd paid my phone bill late because I'd been distracted by investment research, not because I'd forgotten about it. I'd asked about garbage pickup because the schedule had changed, not because I was confused. I'd needed help with the television remote because it controlled a complex entertainment system I'd never used before, not because I was losing my mental faculties. But Michael was presenting these normal moments of adjustment and learning as proof that I was becoming incompetent to manage my own life. Michael, those incidents don't indicate cognitive decline. They indicate adjustment to a new living situation and unfamiliar systems. Mom, denial is part of the aging process. Most elderly people have difficulty accepting that their capabilities are changing, and they resist help even when they clearly need it. Michael was using textbook manipulation tactics, dismissing my self-assessment as denial, presenting his interpretation of my situation as objective reality, and positioning resistance to his control as evidence of the very incapacity he claimed to be addressing. What if you're wrong about my capabilities, Michael? Mom, I'm not wrong. We're living with you every day, we see the struggles you're having, and we're trying to help you make realistic plans for your future. But what if you are wrong? Mom, this hypothetical thinking isn't helpful. We need to deal with the reality of your situation, not with wishful thinking about capabilities you used to have. Michael was so committed to his assessment of my limitations that he couldn't even entertain the possibility that his assumptions might be incorrect. That night, I called Elizabeth Harrison from my garage apartment. Ms. Harrison, Michael is escalating his pressure tactics and setting artificial deadlines for decisions I haven't agreed to make. I think it's time to demonstrate that his assumptions about my situation are completely wrong. Mrs. Richardson, are you ready to reveal your actual financial position? I'm ready to do more than that. I want to show Michael exactly what he's been trying to manipulate, and I want him to understand the legal consequences of elder financial abuse. What did you have in mind? I want to schedule a family meeting where I present my true financial situation and make it clear that his manipulation attempts have been both inappropriate and unsuccessful. Mrs. Richardson, that's a dramatic step. Are you prepared for Michael's reaction when he realizes the magnitude of his miscalculation? Ms. Harrison, I've been preparing for this moment for 4 months. Michael thinks he's dealing with a helpless elderly woman who needs his management and control. It's time for him to learn that he's actually been trying to manipulate someone with more financial resources and legal protection than he could possibly imagine. Mrs. Richardson, when do you want to have this meeting? Thanksgiving Day. Michael has been talking about having everything settled before the holidays. I think Thanksgiving would be an appropriate time for him to learn what he has to be grateful for and what he's about to lose. Elizabeth laughed, but not unkindly. Mrs. Richardson, that's poetic justice. Your son is about to discover that the woman he's been treating like a burden is actually one of the most financially sophisticated people in Vermont. Elizabeth, there's something else I want to do before the Thanksgiving revelation. What's that? I want to buy something that will demonstrate the absurdity of Michael's assumptions about my financial limitations. What kind of purchase were you thinking about? A house. A beautiful, expensive house that will show Michael exactly what his allegedly impoverished mother is capable of affording. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Richardson, that's a significant statement. What kind of property were you considering? There's a lakefront estate in Shelburne that's been on the market for 6 months. 4,000 square feet, private dock, panoramic views of Lake Champlain. The asking price is $1.8 million. Mrs. Richardson, are you serious about purchasing an $1.8 million home just to prove a point to your son? Elizabeth, I'm serious about purchasing an $1.8 million home because I want to and because I can afford it, and because Michael needs to understand that his assumptions about my financial situation have been completely wrong from the beginning. Mrs. Richardson, buying a luxury home while your son thinks you're financially vulnerable is certainly a dramatic way to make your point. Elizabeth, Michael has spent 4 months treating me like a charity case who should be grateful for his assistance. I want him to understand that the woman he's been trying to control actually has more money than he'll ever see in his lifetime. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I made an offer on the Shelburne estate. The sellers accepted my cash offer within 24 hours. and we scheduled a closing for the day after Thanksgiving. Quote, meanwhile, Michael's deadline pressure was reaching fever pitch. Mom, this is the last week Meadowbrook can hold that apartment, Michael announced during our family meeting the Sunday before Thanksgiving. If you don't put down a deposit by Friday, they're going to release it to the next person on the waiting list. Michael, what if I don't want the apartment at Meadowbrook? Mom, what you want and what you need are two different things. You want to maintain your independence, but you need assisted living support. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions for people they love. Who decided that families have to make decisions for me? Mom, we decided that when you moved in here because you couldn't manage on your own anymore. We're your family, and we're not going to stand by and watch you struggle when we can provide better alternatives. What if I'm not struggling, Michael? Mom, you are struggling. You may not want to admit it, but we can see it every day. The confusion about routine tasks, the difficulty managing finances, the inability to make practical decisions about your future. These are signs that you need help, whether you want to accept it or not. Michael was so committed to his narrative about my decline that he couldn't see any evidence to the contrary. In his mind, my resistance to his plans was just more proof that I was becoming incompetent. Michael, what if you're completely wrong about my situation? Mom, I'm not wrong. Jennifer and I live with you, we see your daily challenges, and we understand your limitations better than you do. But hypothetically, what if you were wrong? Mom, this hypothetical thinking is exactly the kind of unrealistic reasoning that shows you need guidance with major decisions. Michael couldn't even engage with the possibility that his assessment might be incorrect, because doing so would undermine the entire foundation of his manipulation strategy. Michael, I want to have a special family meeting on Thanksgiving Day. I have some things to share with you and Jennifer that I think will clarify my situation for everyone. What kind of things? Information about my financial position and my plans for the future. I think it's time for complete transparency about my resources and capabilities. Michael looked pleased, probably assuming that I was finally ready to admit my limitations and accept his guidance about my transition to assisted living. Quote, Mom, I think that's a great idea. Thanksgiving would be the perfect time to finalize your plans and start the new year with everything settled. I agree, Michael. Thanksgiving will definitely be the perfect time for everything to be settled. The week before Thanksgiving, I spent my time making final preparations for Michael's education about exactly who he'd been trying to manipulate. I met with Elizabeth Harrison to review legal documents that would protect my assets from any future manipulation attempts. I confirmed the closing date for my new lakefront estate. I arranged for professional photographs of my investment portfolio statements to be prepared for presentation. I even had a formal competency letter prepared by Dr. Mitchell that would demolish any claims about my mental decline. But most importantly, I prepared the envelope that would change everything. The envelope contained documents that would not only reveal my true financial situation, but would also demonstrate the legal consequences that Michael would face if he continued his manipulation attempts. Inside that simple white envelope were bank statements showing my $3.4 million investment portfolio, real estate documents for the lakefront estate I'd just purchased, and a letter from Elizabeth Harrison explaining Vermont's elder financial abuse laws and the penalties that Michael could face for his manipulation attempts. But the most devastating document in the envelope was a new will that I'd prepared, explicitly excluding Michael from my estate because of his attempts to manipulate and control me. Elizabeth, I said during our final meeting before Thanksgiving, I want Michael to understand that his behavior has consequences. The son who tried to steal his mother's assets and independence will inherit exactly what he deserves from his manipulation attempts. Mrs. Richardson, excluding your son from your estate is a dramatic step. Are you certain that's what you want? Elizabeth, Michael has spent 4 months treating me like an incompetent burden who should be grateful for his charity. He's made decisions about my property without my consent, pressured me to give up my independence, and consistently dismissed my autonomy as evidence of mental decline. Those actions have consequences, and Michael is about to learn what those consequences are. Mrs. Richardson, when Michael sees these documents, he's going to realize that he's not just lost access to your assets, he's lost his inheritance because of his own behavior. Exactly, Elizabeth. I want Michael to understand that respect and love cannot be replaced by manipulation and control. The son who saw his mother as an opportunity rather than a person will discover that opportunities can disappear, when you misjudge the person you're trying to exploit. Thanksgiving morning arrived crisp and clear, with snow dusting the mountains around Lake Champlain. As I prepared for what would be the most important family meeting of my life, I reflected on how much my relationship with Michael had changed over the past 4 months. 4 months ago, I'd moved into his garage apartment thinking I was conducting an experiment in family loyalty. Instead, I discovered that my own son was willing to manipulate, pressure, and control his elderly mother for financial gain. But Michael was about to discover something that would shock him far more than his behavior had shocked me. He was about to learn that the helpless widow he'd been manipulating was actually one of the wealthiest women in Vermont, and that his attempts to control her had cost him everything he thought he was going to gain. The envelope sitting on my nightstand contained documents that would destroy Michael's understanding of everything he thought he knew about his mother, his inheritance, and his future. But first, I had to endure one final Thanksgiving dinner with the family that had spent 4 months treating me like a burden they were generously supporting. Because after today, everything would change, and Michael would spend the rest of his life remembering the moment he learned that calling someone helpless can be the most expensive mistake you ever make. Thanksgiving Day began like every other morning in the Richardson household, with Michael and Jennifer bustling around the kitchen, preparing what they believed would be a celebration of family togetherness and my final acceptance of their plans for my future. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were preparing a feast to commemorate gratitude while having spent the past 4 months demonstrating nothing but entitlement and manipulation toward the family member they claimed to be helping. "Grandma Dot, are you excited about today?" Emma asked as she helped me set the dining room table with Jennifer's best china. My granddaughter was wearing a new dress for the occasion, completely unaware that this Thanksgiving would be unlike any other in our family's history. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm very excited about today. I think everyone is going to learn some very important things about our family." "Daddy says you're going to tell us about your plans for next year. Are you really going to move to that place with the other grandmas?" Emma's innocent question broke my heart. Michael had been preparing her for my departure to assisted living, as if it were already decided, teaching his daughter that elderly family members naturally became burdens who needed to be warehoused with, quote, other grandmas when they became inconvenient. "Emma, I think my plans for next year are going to surprise everyone, including your daddy. Will you still be able to visit me and help with my homework?" "Sweetheart, I'll always be part of your life. But the way our family works together might change after today in ways that will be better for everyone." As Emma and I finished setting the table, I could hear Michael and Jennifer in the kitchen discussing their timeline for my transition to Meadowbrook and the logistics of selling my house. They were treating my future as a project they were managing, rather than decisions that belonged to me. "The deposit for Meadowbrook is due tomorrow," Jennifer was saying, "and Maria Santos wants to list the house by December 1st to catch any buyers who want to close before the end of the year." "I know the timing is tight," Michael replied, "but Mom seems ready to accept the reality of her situation. I think today's conversation will finalize everything." They were so confident that their manipulation had succeeded that they were already celebrating their victory over my autonomy. Michael genuinely believed that his pressure campaign had convinced me to surrender my independence voluntarily, making him the dutiful son who had guided his confused mother toward appropriate care. But Michael was about to discover that his, quote, confused mother had been planning his education for weeks, and that the lesson he was about to receive would be more devastating than anything he could imagine. At exactly 2 o'clock, as we gathered around the dining room table for our traditional Thanksgiving feast, Michael raised his wine glass for what he clearly intended to be a toast celebrating his successful manipulation of my living situation. "I want to say how grateful I am that we can be together as a family today," Michael began, his voice filled with the false warmth of someone who believed he was about to achieve his goals. "This year has brought challenges for all of us, but it's also brought us closer together. Mom, Jennifer and I want you to know how much we've enjoyed having you stay with us, and how excited we are to help you transition to the next chapter of your life." Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "Dot, having you here has been such a blessing. Emma loves having her grandmother nearby, and Michael and I have learned so much about the importance of family taking care of each other." "Taking care of each other," I repeated slowly. "That's an interesting phrase, Jennifer. What do you think it means to take care of family?" "Well, it means making sure everyone is safe and comfortable and has what they need. It means making difficult decisions sometimes, even when they're not popular, because you love someone enough to do what's best for them." Jennifer was describing manipulation as love, control as care, and my resistance to their plans as ingratitude rather than autonomy. Michael, I said, turning to my son, you mentioned being grateful. What are you most grateful for this year? Mom, I'm grateful that we've been able to help you during this difficult transition in your life. I'm grateful that we found solutions to your housing and care needs. And I'm grateful that you've been open to accepting help, even when it meant giving up some independence. Michael was rewriting history again, presenting his manipulation as help and my resistance as eventual cooperation. That's very interesting, Michael. And what are you looking forward to in the coming year? Quote. Mom, I'm looking forward to seeing you settled and happy at Meadowbrook, knowing that you're getting the care and social interaction you need. I'm looking forward to Jennifer and me being able to focus on Emma and my business, knowing that you're in good hands. And you believe that my moving to assisted living and selling my house are the best solutions for my situation? Mom, I know they are. We've researched everything carefully, we've found excellent options, and we've worked out all the financial details. You'll be secure and comfortable, and our family will have peace of mind knowing that you're properly cared for. Michael was so confident in his assessment and his plans that he couldn't imagine any scenario where his conclusions might be wrong. Michael, before we finalize these plans, I have some information to share with you that might affect your understanding of my situation. What kind of information, Mom? I reached into my purse and pulled out the white envelope that contained documents that would destroy every assumption Michael had made about my financial situation and capabilities. Information about my actual financial position and my real plans for the future. Michael and Jennifer exchanged glances, probably expecting me to present some minor savings account or insurance policy that they'd overlooked in their calculations. Mom, we've already reviewed your financial situation pretty thoroughly. We know about your Social Security, Dad's pension benefits, and the equity in your house. Is there something else we should know about? Yes, Michael, there's quite a bit else you should know about. I opened the envelope and spread the first document across the dining room table. It was a portfolio summary from Harrison & Associates showing my investment holdings as of November 20th. Total value, $3,847,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at the document for a full 30 seconds before looking up at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. Mom, what is this? This is a summary of my investment portfolio, Michael. My actual investment portfolio, which I've been managing successfully for over 40 years. That can't be real. Mom, you don't have $3.8 million. Actually, Michael, I do. I've had substantial investments since before you were born. I've been building wealth through careful investing and financial management while appearing to live on your father's modest income. Jennifer was studying the document with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. This shows millions of dollars in stocks and bonds. Where did this money come from? It came from me, Jennifer. From 45 years of careful investing, smart financial decisions, and successful wealth management that I kept private because I believed in living modestly, regardless of my actual resources. Michael was shaking his head as if he could make the numbers disappear through denial. Mom, this has to be some kind of mistake. You've been living in our garage apartment because you couldn't afford to maintain your house. You've been shopping with coupons and worrying about grocery bills. People with millions of dollars don't live like that. Michael, people with millions of dollars live however they choose to live. I chose to live modestly because I believed in saving and investing rather than spending and displaying wealth. The fact that you couldn't imagine any other explanation for my lifestyle choices says more about your assumptions than about my actual situation. But Mom, if you have this much money, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us think you were struggling financially? Michael, you never asked about my finances. You made assumptions about my situation based on superficial observations, and you built plans for my future based on those assumptions. You never once inquired about my actual resources or capabilities. I pulled out the second document from the envelope, the purchase agreement for my new lakefront estate in Shelburne. This is the contract for the house I bought last week, 4,000 square feet on Lake Champlain, which I purchased with cash for $1.8 million. If the portfolio statement had shocked them, the real estate purchase agreement left them speechless. Michael's face had gone completely white, and Jennifer was making small gasping sounds as she tried to process what she was seeing. "You bought a house?" Michael whispered. "I bought a beautiful home, Michael. A home that I can afford easily. And a home where I'll live independently while enjoying the kind of lifestyle that my investments can support." "But Mom, why would you buy an expensive house when we'd already arranged for you to move to assisted living?" Single quote. "Michael, you arranged for me to move to assisted living. I never agreed to that arrangement. You made plans for my future without my consent, based on assumptions about my capabilities and resources that were completely incorrect." "But the apartment at Meadowbrook, the deposit that's due tomorrow." "Michael, I will not be moving to Meadowbrook. I will not be selling my family home. And I will definitely not be placing my financial decisions under your supervision or control." Michael was struggling to reconcile the evidence in front of him with everything he thought he knew about my situation. "Mom, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why have you been living in our garage? Why have you been acting like you needed our help?" "Michael, I moved into your garage apartment to see how you would treat me when you thought I was financially dependent on you. I wanted to understand whether my son would respect and love his mother regardless of her circumstances, or whether he would see her apparent vulnerability as an opportunity for manipulation and control." "That's not fair, Mom. We were trying to help you." "Michael, you were trying to control me. There's a difference between helping someone and making decisions for them without their consent." I pulled out the third document from the envelope. Drive. Mitchell's Cognitive Evaluation Report. This is a professional assessment of my mental competence conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, one of Vermont's leading neuropsychologists. Her evaluation confirms that my cognitive function is not just normal for my age, it's exceptional. My memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making skills are all in the 98th percentile. Michael took the report with shaking hands and scanned the summary page. "The subject demonstrates superior cognitive function across all measured domains," he read aloud. "Mental competence for financial and legal decision-making is unquestionable. Any claims of cognitive decline or incapacity would be contradicted by overwhelming evidence. Michael, the confused, declining elderly woman you thought you were helping doesn't exist. Your assumptions about my mental state were as wrong as your assumptions about my financial situation." "But Mom, you seem to have trouble with daily tasks, bill paying, remembering schedules." "Michael, I had no trouble with any of those things. You interpreted normal moments of adjustment and learning as evidence of cognitive decline, because you wanted to believe that I needed your management and control." Jennifer finally found her voice. "Dot, if you're wealthy and mentally sharp, why did you go along with our plans? Why didn't you just tell us the truth from the beginning?" "Jennifer, I went along with your plans because I wanted to see how far you and Michael would go with your manipulation attempts. I wanted to understand whether you saw me as a person deserving of respect or as a problem that needed to be managed for your convenience." "We never saw you as a problem," Michael protested. "Michael, you saw me as exactly that. You saw my presence in your home as a burden that needed to be resolved. You saw my resistance to your plans as evidence of incompetence rather than autonomy. You made decisions about my property and my future without my consent because you believed I was incapable of making those decisions myself. But we were trying to protect you. Michael, you were trying to control me. And when I didn't cooperate voluntarily, you escalated to threats and ultimatums designed to force my compliance." I pulled out the fourth document from the envelope, a detailed timeline of Michael's manipulation attempts, compiled by Elizabeth Harrison for potential legal proceedings. This document outlines every manipulation tactic you've used over the past 4 months. Unauthorized real estate evaluations of my property, pressure tactics involving artificial deadlines, threats about my declining mental capacity, attempts to control my spending and daily activities. Michael, what you've been doing has a name. It's called elder financial abuse, and it's a felony in Vermont. Michael's face went from white to green as he realized the legal implications of his behavior. Mom, I wasn't trying to abuse you. I was trying to help you make good decisions about your future. Michael, you were trying to access my assets by convincing me that I was incompetent to manage them myself. The fact that you believed your own justifications doesn't change the nature of your actions. What are you going to do? Jennifer asked quietly. I pulled out the final document from the envelope, the new will I'd prepared with Elizabeth Harrison. This is my new will, prepared last week with Vermont's most prestigious estate planning firm. Michael, because of your attempts to manipulate and control me, you have been completely excluded from my estate. The effect of this announcement was immediate and devastating. Michael's hands started shaking as he reached for the will. Mom, you can't be serious. Michael, I'm completely serious. The son who tried to convince his mother that she was incompetent so he could control her assets will inherit exactly what he deserves from those manipulation attempts. Nothing. But I'm your only child. I'm your family. Michael, family members don't manipulate each other for financial gain. Family members don't make major decisions about each other's lives without consent. Family members don't treat each other as burdens to be managed, rather than people to be respected. Mom, I made mistakes, but I was trying to help you. I thought you needed guidance and support. Michael, you never asked what I needed. You decided what I needed based on your assumptions about my limitations, and then you pressured me to accept your decisions regardless of my preferences. I can change, I can do better. Mom, please don't cut me out of your will because of misunderstandings. Michael, these weren't misunderstandings. These were choices you made about how to treat your mother when you thought she was vulnerable and dependent. You revealed your true character when you believed I couldn't defend myself, and that character doesn't deserve to benefit from the wealth you tried to steal. Jennifer was crying now, probably realizing that Michael's manipulation attempts had cost their family millions of dollars. Isn't there anything Michael can do to fix this? Can't we work something out? Jennifer, Michael spent 4 months demonstrating that he saw his mother as an opportunity rather than a person. He can't undo that demonstration, and I won't reward that behavior with an inheritance. Michael was now desperate, grasping for any argument that might salvage his inheritance. Mom, what about Emma? Are you going to punish your granddaughter because of mistakes I made? Michael, Emma will be provided for through a trust that you cannot access or control. She'll receive an excellent education and financial security, but those benefits will come with conditions that ensure she learns to respect elderly people rather than manipulating them. What conditions? Single quote, Emma will inherit her trust when she reaches age 25, but only if she demonstrates respect for elderly people through volunteer work and advocacy. She'll learn that wealth comes with responsibility, and that family relationships are based on love and respect rather than financial convenience. The room was completely silent as Michael and Jennifer processed the magnitude of their losses. The millions of dollars they'd expected to inherit were gone. The elderly woman they'd treated as a burden was actually one of the wealthiest people in Vermont. The manipulation campaign they'd thought was succeeding had actually been documented for potential criminal prosecution. Mom, Michael said finally, his voice barely audible, what happens now? Now, Michael, you learn to live with the consequences of treating your mother like an incompetent burden instead of the capable, successful woman she actually is. Can I visit you at your new house? Michael, you can visit when you've learned to treat me with the respect and dignity that every person deserves, regardless of their age or circumstances. Until then, you're not welcome in my home or my life. How long will it take for me to prove that I've changed? Michael, I don't know if you can change. You spent 4 months manipulating and controlling your mother because you thought she was helpless. That behavior reveals something fundamental about your character that can't be fixed with apologies or promises. But I love you, Mom. Michael, love doesn't manipulate, love doesn't control, love doesn't make major decisions about someone's life without their consent. What you've shown me isn't love. It's entitlement and greed disguised as concern. I stood up from the dining room table and walked toward the door, leaving the documents spread across the surface like evidence in a courtroom. Where are you going? Jennifer asked. I'm going to my new home, where I'll live independently and make my own decisions about my life and my future. Michael and I are done here. Mom, wait, Michael called out, following me toward the door. We need to talk about this. We can work something out. I turned to face my son one last time. Michael, there's nothing to work out. You've shown me exactly who you are when you think someone is vulnerable and defenseless. I'm not vulnerable, I'm not defenseless, and I'm not your victim. The helpless widow you thought you were manipulating never existed, and the wealthy mother you're trying to reconcile with doesn't forgive family members who treat her like a burden. But Mom, I'm your son. Michael, you're the man who tried to steal his mother's independence and assets because he thought she was too stupid and weak to stop him. The fact that you're my son makes your behavior worse, not better. As I walked out the door of Michael's house for the last time, I could hear him and Jennifer arguing in panicked voices about what they were going to do without the inheritance they'd been counting on. But their panic was no longer my concern. I had spent 4 months being treated like a burden by people who should have loved and respected me. I had endured manipulation, control, and condescension from family members who saw my apparent vulnerability as an opportunity for financial gain. Now Michael was experiencing his own kind of vulnerability, the vulnerability of realizing that his assumptions about his mother had cost him everything he thought he was entitled to inherit. But unlike the vulnerability I had pretended to have, Michael's vulnerability was real, permanent, and entirely the result of his own choices. As I drove away from Michael's house in my old Toyota Camry, heading toward my new lakefront estate, I reflected on the perfect justice of how everything had turned out. Michael had spent months trying to convince me that I was too incompetent to manage my own life, and in the process, he had proven that he was too incompetent to manage a relationship with his own mother. The son who had called me a burden was about to discover what it felt like to carry the burden of losing millions of dollars because of his own greed and manipulation. And the envelope I had left on his kitchen table would serve as a permanent reminder that underestimating someone can be the most expensive lesson you ever receive, especially when the person you're underestimating has spent 50 years proving exactly how wrong your assumptions can be. The drive to my new lakefront estate in Shelburne took 45 minutes through the rolling hills of Vermont, but it felt like a journey between two completely different worlds. Behind me was the life where I'd been treated as a burden, a problem to be managed, an elderly woman whose opinions didn't matter and whose autonomy was negotiable. Ahead of me was a life where I would be recognized for exactly what I was, a successful, independent, financially sophisticated woman who had earned the right to live on her own terms. As I pulled into the circular driveway of my new home, watching the late afternoon sun reflect off the windows overlooking Lake Champlain, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with justice. This wasn't just a beautiful house. It was a symbol of everything Michael had underestimated about my capabilities and resources. The house was everything the listing had promised and more. 4,000 square feet of elegant living space, with vaulted ceilings, hardwood floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the lake and mountains. A gourmet kitchen with commercial-grade appliances, a library with built-in bookcases that would house my collection of investment books and financial journals, a master suite with a spa-like bathroom, and enough space to entertain dozens of people comfortably. But the most satisfying feature was the formal dining room with a conference table that could seat 12 people. This would be where I hosted the board meetings and business conferences that would demonstrate my professional competence to anyone who still had doubts about my mental acuity. As I walked through my new home for the first time as its owner, my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Michael's number. I didn't answer. Over the next 3 hours, Michael called 17 times. Jennifer called 8 times. Even Emma called once, probably coached by her parents to ask Grandma Dot to come back and fix things with her daddy. I didn't answer any of the calls. Michael and Jennifer had spent 4 months making decisions about my life without including me in their discussions. Now they could spend some time wondering about their own futures while I settled into my new life on my own terms. The next morning brought a knock on my door at exactly 8 a.m. Through the peephole, I could see Michael standing on my front porch, looking like he hadn't slept all night. His hair was disheveled, his clothes were wrinkled, and he had the desperate expression of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his losses. I opened the door but didn't invite him inside. "Mom, we need to talk." "About what, Michael?" "About everything. About the misunderstandings, about my mistakes, about how we can fix this situation." "What misunderstandings, Michael?" "Mom, I thought you needed help. I thought you were struggling financially and couldn't manage on your own. I was trying to take care of you." Michael, you thought I needed help because you wanted to believe I needed help. It justified your plans to control my assets and manage my life for your own benefit. That's not true, Mom. I was genuinely concerned about your welfare. Michael, if you were concerned about my welfare, you would have asked me what I wanted instead of deciding what I needed. You would have respected my autonomy instead of pressuring me to accept your control. But Mom, you were living in my garage apartment. You seemed confused about daily tasks. You appeared to be struggling with financial decisions. Michael, I was conducting an experiment in family loyalty. I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I was vulnerable and dependent. You failed that test spectacularly. Mom, that's not fair. You can't test people without telling them they're being tested. Michael, life is a test of character that doesn't come with advance warning. You revealed your true character when you thought I couldn't defend myself, and that character doesn't deserve to inherit the wealth you tried to steal. Michael's desperation was becoming more obvious as he realized that apologies and explanations weren't going to reverse the consequences of his behavior. Mom, what do I have to do to earn back your trust? What do I have to do to get back into your will? Michael, trust isn't something you earn back after betraying it. It's something you build through consistent respect and integrity. You can't manipulate your way back into someone's good graces after trying to manipulate them out of their independence. But I can change. I can learn from my mistakes. Mom, please give me a chance to prove that I'm different now. Michael, you're not different now. You're the same person who tried to control his mother for financial gain. You're just scared because your manipulation attempts failed. Fear of consequences isn't the same as genuine remorse. What about Emma? Are you going to abandon your granddaughter because of my mistakes? Michael, Emma will be well provided for, but she'll learn values that you apparently never learned. She'll understand that elderly people deserve respect, that family relationships are based on love rather than financial opportunity, and that wealth comes with responsibility to protect vulnerable people rather than exploit them. Mom, I was trying to protect you. Michael, you were trying to control me. There's a fundamental difference between protection and control that you've never understood. Michael stood on my porch for another 10 minutes, cycling through increasingly desperate arguments and promises, but eventually realized that I wasn't going to change my position based on his emotional appeals. Mom, is this really how you want our relationship to end? Michael, our relationship ended when you decided to treat me like an incompetent burden, instead of the capable woman who raised you. Everything that's happened since then has just been you learning about the consequences of that decision. As Michael walked back to his car, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. I was sad that my own son had chosen manipulation over respect, control over love, and greed over integrity. I was sad that the little boy I'd raised with infinite patience and sacrifice had grown into a man who would exploit his elderly mother for financial gain. But I wasn't sad enough to forgive him or restore his inheritance. Some lessons are too important to soften with sentiment, and some consequences are too necessary to reverse with emotion. Over the next few weeks, as I settled into my new home and new life, the full impact of my Thanksgiving revelation began to ripple through the community. Elizabeth Harrison called to congratulate me on my successful defense against family manipulation and to discuss the broader implications of my case. Mrs. Richardson, your situation has generated significant interest among our colleagues who specialize in elder protection. Would you be willing to speak at conferences about family manipulation tactics and defensive strategies? Elizabeth, I'd be honored to help other elderly people recognize and resist family manipulation. If my experience can protect even one person from what I went through, then everything Michael put me through will have served a positive purpose. Mrs. Richardson, you've become something of a legend in Vermont legal circles. The elderly woman who documented her son's manipulation attempts while appearing helpless, then revealed her true wealth and competence in the most dramatic way possible. Your case is going to be studied in law schools as an example of how sophisticated people can protect themselves from family exploitation. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the neuropsychologist who had conducted my competency evaluation, called to ask if I would consider serving on the board of Vermont Elder Advocacy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly people from abuse and exploitation. Mrs. Richardson, your case represents exactly the kind of sophisticated elder abuse that often goes undetected because the victims appear to be willingly cooperating with their families' plans. Would you be interested in helping us develop better detection and prevention strategies? Dr. Mitchell, I would be very interested in that work. I want to make sure that other elderly people don't have to endure what I experienced, and I want families to understand that there are serious consequences for treating elderly relatives as opportunities rather than people. Within 6 months of my Thanksgiving revelation, I had become one of Vermont's leading advocates for elder rights and protection. My story had been featured in newspapers, legal journals, and elder advocacy publications as an example of how family manipulation could be recognized, documented, and defeated. But more importantly, my case had led to stronger legal protections for elderly people and better training for professionals who work with families experiencing elder abuse situations. The Dorothy Richardson Foundation for Elder Protection, which I established with a substantial portion of my assets, was funding legal aid programs, educational initiatives, and support services in 12 states. We were helping elderly people recognize manipulation tactics, providing legal representation for those facing family exploitation, and educating younger people about the importance of respecting elderly relatives, regardless of their apparent vulnerabilities. Emma's education was also part of my legacy planning. At age 9, she was too young to understand the full implications of what had happened between her father and grandmother, but she was old enough to begin learning about respect, integrity, and the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their age or circumstances. I arranged for Emma to spend weekends with me at the lakefront house, where we would work on educational projects about elderly contributions to society, volunteer with senior citizens organizations, and discuss the difference between helping people and controlling them. Grandma Dot, Emma asked during one of our weekend visits, why doesn't Daddy come to see your new house? Sweetheart, your daddy made some choices about how to treat people that had consequences he didn't expect. Sometimes when we make poor choices, we have to live with results we don't like. Did Daddy make poor choices about you? Yes, Emma, he did. Your daddy decided to treat me like I wasn't smart enough to make my own decisions, and that hurt my feelings very much. Will you ever forgive him? Emma, forgiveness isn't just about saying you're sorry after you hurt someone. It's about proving that you've learned from your mistakes and that you won't make them again. Your daddy hasn't shown me that he's learned anything except that his manipulation attempts didn't work. What would Daddy have to do to show you he learned his lesson? He would have to demonstrate genuine respect for elderly people, not just apologize to me. He would have to show that he understands why his behavior was wrong, not just that it had consequences he didn't like. And he would have to prove that he's changed his fundamental attitude about how families should treat each other. Emma was learning lessons about respect, integrity, and consequences that her father had apparently never absorbed, despite being raised by parents who had tried to model those values. But the most satisfying development in my new life came from an unexpected source: my former neighbors on Maple Street, who had always seen me as the modest widow who lived quietly in her deceased husband's house. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door to my old house, called me about 6 months after my move to Shelburne. Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to tell you how proud we all are of what you accomplished. The whole neighborhood has been talking about how you stood up to your son's manipulation and proved that elderly people shouldn't be underestimated. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. That means a great deal to me. Dorothy, several of us have been dealing with similar pressure from our adult children about selling our houses and moving to assisted living. Could you come speak to our neighborhood association about how to recognize manipulation tactics and protect ourselves from family pressure? I'd be happy to do that, Mrs. Chen. Nobody should have to endure what I went through, and I want to help other people recognize the warning signs before the manipulation becomes as severe as what Michael attempted. That neighborhood meeting led to dozens of similar speaking engagements throughout Vermont and neighboring states. I discovered that my experience with family manipulation was far more common than I had realized, and that many elderly people were facing similar pressure from adult children who saw their parents' assets as solutions to their own financial problems. But I also discovered that most elderly people facing family manipulation didn't have the resources or knowledge to defend themselves effectively. Unlike me, they didn't have millions of dollars in hidden assets or decades of investment experience to fall back on when their families tried to control their lives. That's when I realized that my true mission wasn't just protecting myself from Michael's manipulation. It was using my experience and resources to protect other elderly people who might not be able to defend themselves as effectively. The Richardson Foundation expanded its programs to include direct financial assistance for elderly people facing family manipulation, legal representation for those challenging guardianship petitions, and emergency housing for seniors who needed to escape abusive family situations. We also developed educational programs for adult children about the ethical and legal obligations they had toward elderly parents, and the serious consequences that could result from treating elderly family members as burdens rather than people deserving of respect. 1 year after my Thanksgiving revelation, I received a letter that made all of the pain and betrayal of Michael's manipulation worthwhile. Quote, the letter was from Margaret Santos, an 84-year-old woman in New Hampshire, whose daughter had been pressuring her to sell her house and move to assisted living so the daughter could access the proceeds to pay off credit card debts. Dear Mrs. Richardson, the letter began, I attended your presentation at the Manchester Senior Center last month, and I wanted to thank you for giving me the courage to stand up to my daughter's manipulation attempts. After hearing your story, I realized that I didn't have to accept my daughter's assessment of my capabilities or agree to her plans for my future. Margaret went on to explain that she had sought legal representation, documented her daughter's manipulation tactics, and successfully resisted pressure to give up her independence and assets. Mrs. Richardson, your story showed me that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless, and that family members don't have the right to make decisions for us just because they think they know what's best. I'm still living in my own home, managing my own finances, and making my own decisions about my future. Thank you for showing me that it was possible to fight back. That letter, and dozens of others like it, confirmed that my experience with Michael had served a purpose far beyond my own protection. By refusing to accept his manipulation and documenting the consequences of his behavior, I had created a model that other elderly people could follow when facing similar family exploitation. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of my choices came from an unexpected source, Emma herself, who was now 10 years old and beginning to understand the broader implications of what had happened in our family. Grandma Dot, she said during one of our weekend visits, I've been thinking about what happened with Daddy, and I think I understand why you were so upset with him. What do you think you understand, sweetheart? I think Daddy treated you like you weren't smart enough to make your own choices, kind of like how some adults treat kids. But you are smart enough, and you proved it by showing him how wrong he was. Emma's insight was remarkably sophisticated for her age, and it confirmed that she was learning the lessons about respect and autonomy that her father had failed to absorb. Emma, what do you think people should do when someone treats them like they're not capable of making their own decisions? Single quote, quote, I think they should prove that person wrong, just like you did. And I think they should make sure that person learns not to treat other people that way anymore. That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to learn hard lessons about respecting others, and sometimes those lessons have to be expensive enough that they never forget them. As I sit in my beautiful lakefront home 2 years after that transformative Thanksgiving Day, I often reflect on the perfect justice of how everything unfolded. Michael's attempt to manipulate and control me had backfired so completely that it had created a national movement to protect elderly people from family exploitation. Michael himself had learned that there are severe personal and financial consequences for treating elderly family members as opportunities rather than people. He lost his inheritance, his relationship with his mother, and his standing in the community when word spread about his manipulation attempts. But more importantly, he had unknowingly contributed to a broader social change that would protect thousands of other elderly people from experiencing the manipulation and control that he had attempted to impose on me. The son who had called me helpless and tried to convince me I was incompetent had inadvertently proven that I was one of the most capable and resourceful people he would ever encounter. And the envelope I had left on his kitchen table that Thanksgiving Day had become a symbol of how dramatically the tables can turn when someone underestimates the wrong person. Jennifer had filed for divorce 6 months after the Thanksgiving revelation, citing Michael's financial manipulation and emotional abuse as grounds for ending their marriage. She had received custody of Emma, and a substantial settlement that ensured my granddaughter's stability during the transition. Jennifer had also written me a letter apologizing for her complicity in Michael's manipulation campaign and asking if we could rebuild our relationship for Emma's sake. She wrote, I realize now that I enabled Michael's controlling behavior because I was afraid of confronting him and because I was seduced by the idea of financial security that his plan seemed to offer. I should have defended you when I saw what he was doing, and I should have questioned his assumptions about your capabilities. I hope you can forgive me and allow me to be part of Emma's relationship with you. I had agreed to work with Jennifer on co-parenting arrangements that would allow Emma to maintain relationships with both sides of her family while learning healthy values about respect and integrity. But Michael remained completely excluded from my life and my estate. He had made repeated attempts over the past 2 years to apologize, to explain his behavior, and to convince me that he had learned from his mistakes. But Michael's apologies always focused on the consequences he was experiencing rather than the harm he had caused me. He was sorry that he had lost his inheritance, sorry that his marriage had ended, sorry that his reputation in the community had been damaged, but he never demonstrated genuine understanding of why his behavior had been fundamentally wrong. Mom, he had said during his most recent attempt at reconciliation, I know I made mistakes, but I was trying to help you. I thought you needed guidance and support, and I was trying to provide that guidance in the best way I knew how. Michael, I had replied, the fact that you still describe your manipulation attempts as help proves that you haven't learned anything from this experience, except that your tactics didn't work. You're not sorry that you tried to control me, you're sorry that you failed. But Mom, I love you. Doesn't that count for anything? Michael, love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't pressure people to give up their independence. Love doesn't make major decisions about someone's life without their consent. What you showed me wasn't love. It was entitlement disguised as concern. Michael's inability to understand the fundamental difference between love and control confirmed that excluding him from my estate had been the right decision. He couldn't inherit wealth that he had tried to steal, and he couldn't benefit from the success of a woman whose capabilities he had consistently underestimated. As I prepare for bed in my beautiful lakefront home this evening, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off Lake Champlain, I feel a deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically and defending my autonomy against people who thought they could control me. Michael's manipulation attempts had been intended to diminish me, control me, and reduce me to a helpless victim dependent on his management. Instead, his attacks had motivated me to reveal capabilities I had kept hidden for decades, build programs that protected thousands of vulnerable elderly people, and create a legacy that would defend against family exploitation for generations to come. The helpless widow Michael thought he was manipulating never existed. But the powerful advocate for elder rights that emerged from his manipulation attempts has become one of Vermont's most influential voices for protecting vulnerable people from family exploitation. And the simple white envelope I left on his kitchen table that Thanksgiving Day has become a symbol of how expensive it can be to underestimate someone, especially when that someone has spent 72 years proving exactly how wrong your assumptions about her capabilities can be. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't just living well, it's using your success to protect other people from experiencing the same kind of treatment you endured, and making sure that the people who tried to control you never get the chance to benefit from the wealth and wisdom they tried to steal. The woman Michael called helpless turned out to be magnificent, and the consequences of his inability to see that magnificence will last for the rest of his life. As my final act each evening, I walk through my home and appreciate everything I've built. Not just the financial success and beautiful surroundings, but the programs that protect vulnerable people, the relationships based on genuine respect, and the knowledge that I never allowed anyone to diminish my worth or control my destiny. And in the morning, I'll wake up and continue the work of proving that elderly people are capable of extraordinary things when they're given the respect and autonomy they deserve. Because the best way to honor the woman Michael tried to diminish is to never stop demonstrating exactly how wrong he was about everything he thought he knew about his mother. And that's a lesson I plan to keep teaching for as long as I live. 3 years have passed since that transformative Thanksgiving Day when I left a simple white envelope on Michael's kitchen table and walked away from his manipulation attempts forever. As I sit in my library this morning, surrounded by awards from elder advocacy organizations and letters from hundreds of people whose lives have been changed by my story, I'm struck by how completely my life has been transformed by Michael's attempt to control and diminish me. The irony is perfect and profound. The son who tried to convince his mother that she was helpless and incompetent inadvertently created one of the most powerful advocates for elderly rights in American history. Michael's manipulation attempts didn't just fail. They backfired so spectacularly that they generated a movement that has protected thousands of vulnerable people from exactly the kind of exploitation he attempted. This morning's mail brought 3 letters that perfectly illustrate how far the ripple effects of that Thanksgiving confrontation have spread. The first letter came from Dr. Patricia Williams at Harvard Law School, inviting me to deliver the keynote address at their annual symposium on elder protection law. Mrs. Richardson, she wrote, "Your case has become the gold standard for how sophisticated individuals can document and defeat family manipulation attempts. Your strategies are now taught in law schools across the country as examples of proactive elder protection." The second letter came from Senator Margaret Chen of Vermont, informing me that the state legislature had passed the Richardson Elder Protection Act, which strengthened penalties for family financial abuse and established better legal protections for elderly people facing manipulation from relatives. "Your courage in standing up to family exploitation," the senator wrote, "has created legal protections that will defend vulnerable Vermonters for generations to come." But the third letter was the most meaningful of all. It came from Emma, now 13 years old and remarkably mature for her age, written in her careful handwriting on personalized stationery. "Dear Grandma Dot," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that I'm presenting my science fair project about ageism and elder abuse next week, and I'm dedicating it to you. I've learned so much about respecting elderly people and recognizing when families are being manipulative instead of helpful. I hope I never treat anyone the way Daddy treated you, and I hope I can help other kids learn about treating elderly people with dignity and respect." Emma's letter confirmed that the most important lesson of this entire experience was being passed to the next generation. My granddaughter was learning values of respect, integrity, and justice that her father had failed to absorb, ensuring that the cycle of manipulation would end with his generation. As I prepared for my morning walk along the lake, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a familiar voice that I hadn't heard in over a year. "Mom?" Michael's voice was tentative, uncertain, completely different from the confident manipulation tone he'd used during his pressure campaign 3 years ago. "Hello, Michael." "Mom, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to tell you something that I think you should know." "What is it, Michael?" "I've been getting help, professional help. I've been working with a therapist who specializes in family manipulation and emotional abuse, and I'm finally starting to understand what I did to you." This was new. In all of Michael's previous attempts at reconciliation, he had never acknowledged that his behavior constituted abuse or sought professional help to understand his actions. "What kind of understanding have you reached, Michael?" "Mom, I realize now that I wasn't trying to help you. I was trying to control you. I was treating you like you were incompetent because it justified taking over your life and your assets. I convinced myself that I was being a good son, but I was actually being an abuser." For the first time in 3 years, Michael was using language that suggested genuine insight rather than self-serving excuses. "Go on, Michael." "Mom, I also understand now that saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I can't just apologize for abusing you and expect forgiveness. I have to prove that I've changed by how I treat other people, especially elderly people, who might be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation I attempted with you. What are you doing to prove that you've changed?" "I've been volunteering at the senior center for 8 months. I help elderly people with technology, transportation, and household tasks, but only when they ask for help, and only in ways that respect their autonomy and decision-making. I've also been attending support groups for family members who have manipulated elderly relatives." This was significantly different from Michael's previous approaches, which had focused on apologizing to me rather than demonstrating changed behavior toward elderly people in general. "Michael, why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that your decision to exclude me from your will and cut me out of your life wasn't just punishment, it was education. I needed to learn that there are serious consequences for treating elderly people as opportunities, rather than human beings deserving of respect. And what have you learned from those consequences? I've learned that losing your inheritance was the least of what I deserved. I've learned that I damaged my relationship with my own mother because I was more interested in controlling her assets than loving her as a person. And I've learned that the elderly people I work with now are incredibly capable, wise, and valuable. Everything I refused to see when I was trying to manipulate you. Michael's words suggested a level of insight and remorse that I hadn't heard from him before, but I remained cautious about accepting his transformation at face value. Michael, what do you want from this conversation? I don't want anything, Mom. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness or to be restored to your will. I'm calling because I wanted you to know that your decision to fight back against my manipulation taught me lessons that I couldn't have learned any other way. What lessons? That elderly people deserve respect regardless of their apparent circumstances, that family relationships should be based on love and mutual support, not control and exploitation, and that assuming someone is helpless because of their age or situation can be the most expensive mistake you ever make. Michael had finally articulated the fundamental lessons that his manipulation attempts should have taught him, but it had taken 3 years of consequences for him to reach that understanding. Michael, I appreciate you sharing your insights with me, but you understand that recognizing your mistakes doesn't undo the harm you caused or restore the relationship you damaged. I understand that completely, Mom. I'm not asking for restoration. I'm thanking you for teaching me something essential about human dignity that I was too selfish and manipulative to learn on my own. Single quote. Thank you for saying that, Michael. Mom, there's one more thing I want you to know. Emma has been telling me about the work you're doing to protect other elderly people from family manipulation. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, and I'm grateful that my terrible behavior led to something that has helped so many vulnerable people. Michael, your behavior was terrible, but it did serve a purpose beyond our family situation. Mom, I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to spend the rest of my life proving that I learned from it. Every elderly person I help, every family member I counsel about treating elderly relatives with respect, every donation I make to elder protection organizations, all of that is my way of honoring the lesson you taught me. As I ended the phone conversation with Michael, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but a sense of completion. Michael had finally demonstrated genuine understanding of his behavior and its consequences, and he was channeling that understanding into actions that protected other vulnerable people. But more importantly, his transformation confirmed that the most devastating consequence of his manipulation attempts hadn't been losing his inheritance. It had been discovering that he was capable of abusing his own mother for financial gain. That knowledge had forced him to confront fundamental questions about his character and values that he couldn't answer without professional help and genuine change. Later that afternoon, as I reviewed applications for the Richardson Foundation's legal aid program, I received another call that brought the full circle of my experience into sharp focus. Mrs. Richardson, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Vermont State Police. I'm calling about a case that I think might interest you. What kind of case, Detective Martinez? We're investigating a family manipulation scheme that's very similar to what you experienced with your son. An elderly man in Rutland is being pressured by his daughter and son-in-law to sell his house and move to assisted living so they can access his assets. The victim mentioned your story and asked if we could consult with you about documentation and legal strategies. Detective Martinez, I'd be happy to help in any way I can. Mrs. Richardson, your case has become our template for investigating elder financial abuse. The documentation strategies you used, the legal protections you implemented, and the way you revealed your true situation have helped us solve dozens of similar cases over the past 3 years. I'm glad my experience has been useful for protecting other people. Mrs. Richardson, we've identified over 200 cases of family manipulation in Vermont alone since your story became public. Your willingness to share your strategies has given other elderly people the tools they need to defend themselves against family exploitation. That evening, as I prepared for the monthly board meeting of the Richardson Foundation, I reflected on how completely my life's purpose had been transformed by Michael's manipulation attempts. 3 years ago, I had been a wealthy but anonymous widow whose investment success was known only to my financial advisors. Today, I was recognized nationally as an expert on elder protection, family manipulation, and the legal strategies that vulnerable people could use to defend their autonomy. The Richardson Foundation had grown from a personal response to family abuse into a national organization with chapters in 18 states. We had provided legal representation for over 1,000 elderly people facing family manipulation, funded research into elder abuse prevention, and trained thousands of professionals to recognize and respond to family exploitation. But perhaps our most important work was educational, teaching elderly people to recognize manipulation tactics, training family members about ethical obligations toward elderly relatives, and showing the broader society that assumptions about elderly capabilities could be not just wrong but devastatingly expensive for those who made them. As the board members arrived for our monthly meeting, lawyers, social workers, elder advocates, and survivors of family manipulation, I looked around the conference table in my lakefront home and marveled at how Michael's attempt to control me had created this network of protection for vulnerable people. Ladies and gentlemen, I began the meeting, our quarterly report shows that we've helped defend over 300 additional elderly people from family manipulation in the past 3 months. Each of these cases represents someone who might otherwise have lost their independence, their assets, or their dignity to family members who saw them as opportunities rather than people. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, who had become the Foundation's legal director, provided updates on our most significant cases. Dorothy, we're seeing a pattern of increased reporting as more elderly people learn about the legal protections available to them. Your story has given vulnerable people the courage to speak up when they're being manipulated, and it's given professionals the tools to recognize and document family abuse. What's our success rate in these cases? 97%, Dorothy. When elderly people use the documentation and legal strategies we've developed based on your experience, they're almost always successful in defending against family manipulation attempts. That success rate represented thousands of people who had maintained their independence, protected their assets, and preserved their dignity because they'd learned from my experience with Michael. As the board meeting concluded, I walked out onto my deck overlooking Lake Champlain and thought about the perfect justice of how everything had unfolded. Michael's manipulation attempts had been intended to reduce me to a helpless victim dependent on his control. Instead, they had motivated me to become one of the most powerful advocates for elderly rights in the country. His assumptions about my incompetence had led him to underestimate someone who turned out to be extraordinarily capable of defending herself and others. His greed for my assets had cost him an inheritance worth millions of dollars, while funding programs that protected thousands of vulnerable people. His disrespect for my autonomy had generated a movement that strengthened legal protections for elderly people nationwide. And his conviction that elderly people were naturally declining and needed younger people's management had been disproven so dramatically that it had changed public attitudes about aging and capability. 6 months later, on the 4th anniversary of that transformative Thanksgiving Day, I received an invitation that represented the ultimate validation of everything I had accomplished. The letter came from the White House, inviting me to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for my work in elder advocacy and protection. Mrs. Richardson, the letter read, "Your courage in standing up to family manipulation and your dedication to protecting vulnerable elderly Americans has made you a national symbol of dignity, resilience, and justice. Your work has strengthened legal protections for millions of elderly people and demonstrated that age is no barrier to making extraordinary contributions to society." As I prepared for the ceremony at the White House, I thought about how Michael would react when he saw his mother receiving the nation's highest civilian honor for work that had grown directly from his attempts to manipulate and control her. Emma, now 14 and serving as my date for the ceremony, helped me choose the perfect outfit for the occasion. "Grandma Dot, I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished. I can't wait to tell my friends that my grandmother is receiving a medal from the president." "Emma, the most important thing isn't the medal. It's the lesson that elderly people are capable of extraordinary achievements when they're treated with respect and given the opportunity to use their wisdom and experience." "Grandma Dot, do you think Daddy will watch the ceremony on television?" "I'm sure he will, sweetheart. And I hope it reminds him that the mother he tried to control turned out to be someone worth honoring at the highest levels of government." "Do you think he's really changed, Grandma Dot?" Emma, I think your father has learned important lessons about respecting elderly people and treating family members with dignity. Whether that change is permanent remains to be seen, but he's certainly doing better work in the world than he was doing 3 years ago. Will you ever forgive him? Emma, forgiveness isn't just about letting go of anger. It's about trust and restoration of relationship. Your father hurt me deeply by trying to exploit my apparent vulnerability, and that kind of betrayal changes a relationship permanently. But I'm glad he's using his experience to help other elderly people, and I hope he continues that work for the rest of his life. The ceremony at the White House was everything I could have hoped for and more. As the president placed the Medal of Freedom around my neck, I thought about all the elderly people who were living independently and safely because they had learned from my experience with family manipulation. Mrs. Richardson, the president said during his remarks, your story demonstrates that defending yourself against exploitation isn't just a personal victory, it's a contribution to justice that protects everyone who might face similar challenges. You have shown that assuming someone is helpless because of their age can be one of the most expensive mistakes anyone can make. The audience of dignitaries, advocates, and fellow medal recipients stood and applauded for almost 2 minutes. But the most meaningful moment came when I saw Emma in the audience, tears streaming down her face, completely overwhelmed with pride for her grandmother's achievements. After the ceremony, as Emma and I toured the White House, she asked the question that brought everything full circle. Grandma Dot, what do you think would have happened if Daddy had treated you with respect from the beginning instead of trying to control you? Emma, if your father had asked me what I wanted instead of deciding what I needed, I would have helped him with his business problems without requiring him to give up his integrity or manipulate his mother. I had more than enough money to solve his financial difficulties, and I would have been happy to help if he had approached me with honesty and respect. So he could have gotten the help he needed without losing his inheritance? Exactly, sweetheart. Your father's manipulation attempts weren't just morally wrong, they were completely unnecessary. If he had treated me as a capable adult deserving of respect, he would have discovered that I was willing and able to help him in ways he never imagined. But then you might not have started the foundation or helped all those other elderly people. That's true, Emma. Sometimes terrible experiences lead to wonderful outcomes that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Your father's betrayal taught me that I needed to use my resources and experience to protect other vulnerable people from family exploitation. As our plane lifted off from Washington that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with Michael's decision to treat his mother as an incompetent burden, and had culminated in my receiving the nation's highest civilian honor for protecting elderly people from exactly that kind of treatment. The simple white envelope I had left on Michael's kitchen table 4 years ago had contained documents that destroyed his assumptions about my capabilities and resources, but more importantly, it had launched a movement that had protected thousands of vulnerable people and changed how American society thought about aging, capability, and family relationships. Quote, Michael's attempt to manipulate and control me had failed so spectacularly that it had generated legal protections, educational programs, and advocacy organizations that would defend elderly people for generations to come. The son who had called his mother helpless had inadvertently proven that she was one of the most powerful and influential people he would ever encounter, and the consequences of his manipulation attempts would protect vulnerable elderly people long after both of us were gone, ensuring that his attempt to exploit his mother had ultimately served the cause of justice rather than greed. As I write these final words in my library overlooking Lake Champlain, surrounded by awards, letters of gratitude, and documentation of lives changed and protected, I'm struck by the perfect irony of how Michael's story ended. He had tried to convince his mother that she was too incompetent to manage her own life, and in the process he had motivated her to become a national expert on protecting elderly people from family manipulation. He had assumed that his mother was financially vulnerable and needed his control, and he had discovered that she was wealthy enough to fund a national movement for elder protection. He had believed that elderly people were naturally declining and needed younger people's management, and his mother had received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for proving exactly the opposite. And he had thought that the worst consequence of his manipulation would be his mother's resistance to his plans, never imagining that the real consequence would be losing everything he thought he was entitled to inherit while watching his mother become a national symbol of elderly empowerment and dignity. The envelope I left on his table that Thanksgiving Day contained more than financial documents and legal warnings. It contained proof that underestimating someone can be the most expensive lesson you ever receive, especially when that someone has spent 75 years building the wisdom, resources, and determination to prove exactly how wrong your assumptions can be. But perhaps the most satisfying part of this entire experience is knowing that Michael's manipulation attempts, which were intended to diminish and control me, have instead created a legacy that will protect vulnerable elderly people for generations to come. Quote, "Because sometimes the best revenge isn't just proving that someone was wrong about you, it's using their betrayal to build something so meaningful and powerful that their attempt to harm you ends up protecting thousands of other people from experiencing the same kind of treatment." The woman Michael called helpless turned out to be magnificent, and the consequences of his failure to recognize that magnificence will last forever. This morning, as I prepare for another day of advocacy work, speaking engagements, and foundation management, I carry with me the knowledge that every elderly person who maintains their independence because of our programs, every family member who learns to respect rather than manipulate elderly relatives, and every legal protection that defends vulnerable people from exploitation exists because one son made the mistake of underestimating his mother. Michael's manipulation attempts were meant to be the end of my autonomy and the beginning of his control over my life and assets. Instead, they became the beginning of my most important work, and the end of his inheritance, his marriage, and his assumptions about what elderly people are capable of achieving when they refuse to accept other people's limitations. And that's a lesson worth teaching for as long as I live. Author's note: this story is dedicated to every elderly person who has ever been underestimated, manipulated, or treated as a burden by people who should have recognized their wisdom, capability, and dignity. Age is not a limitation. It's an accumulation of experience, knowledge, and strength that deserves respect, not control. If you or someone you know is experiencing elder abuse or family manipulation, resources are available. Contact your local Adult Protective Services, the National Elder Abuse Hotline, 1-800-677-1116, or consult with an elder law attorney about legal protections and advocacy options. Remember, being elderly doesn't mean being helpless, and family relationships should be based on love and respect, not control and exploitation. Thank you for reading, and please share this story with anyone who might benefit from understanding that underestimating someone based on age, appearance, or circumstances can be the most expensive mistake they ever make.